And as you've already met, Donald Brown. Donald is the Regional Quality Assurance Manager for Region 10, and he leads, he's in the Laboratory Sciences and Appliance Science Division, and he leads a team of experts that do a whole variety of things. And one of them of importance to a lot of you are QAPPs, or Quality Assurance Project Plans. And I was delighted to meet Donald. I thought I knew about QAPPs until I met Donald. And I feel like I know a lot more about the different kinds of QAPPs. And so that's what we're going to turn to next. Is Donald is actually going to take control and share his screen. And Donald has also brought with us, with him to us, Megan Dunn, who introduced herself earlier as a QA chemist. She will be, Megan and probably Donald and others as well will be available to help folks who are developing QAPPs down the road. But for now, we're going to listen to Donald and learn more about the different types of QAPPs. At the end of his presentation, we'll entertain any questions you have specifically for Donald, of course. But we also want to have a little discussion going back to that idea of a generalized or program. You'll see those words are specific. We're throwing them around pretty loosely without you, Donald. So we're glad to have you here to help us figure out what, if any of those actual formal things fit the needs here. And if not, what are the other ways that this community could work together to support each other by sharing resources? So it might not be a generalized QAPP. There might be some other way. So we'll have a discussion after Donald has done his presentation. So I'm sorry, I'm looking at the chat. I got distracted. So Donald, are you ready?
Yep, but I'm going to try to share here. Tell me if that comes up.
Thank you, Donald, for joining us.
Yep. Do you see that? It looks good? Cool.
Great.
Perfect. All right. So thank you for that introduction, Jen. Yeah, I don't have much more to share beyond that. Since I already introduced myself and did such a good job explaining kind of my role at EPA. So, I mean, just generally, I do oversee Region 10's quality system, and that does include a lot. But one of the main things is our quality assurance project plans. And so I wanted. So, as Jen mentioned, one of the things that I was asked about was to go through pretty generally the different types of QAPPs, and certainly this is not an exclusive list. There are other ones and different kinds that are very, very specific. Like, for example, maybe you've heard of a UFP QAPP that's very for like Department of Defense. I'm not going to go through that. It wouldn't be applicable here. But here I'm going through a pretty high level of really general types of QAPPs. So project QAPP, a generic QAPP, programmatic QAPP, and umbrella QAPP. And we'll explain what each one of those are as we move through here. So I always like to take this opportunity to kind of go through. So when is a QAPP needed? And I will say that if you are receiving federal funds from EPA, that it is in the terms and conditions of grants. So that it usually triggers it. But more generally, QAPPs are required whenever environmental information is collected, generated, evaluated, or used. And this can manifest itself in many different ways. I think most people are familiar with just the direct measurements of environmental parameters. So going out into the field and taking like a HORIBA and measuring different things like water temperature or pH, those are direct measurements. So a QAPP would be required for that. Also, any type of analytical testing. So whether that's in the field or you're sending samples to a lab, QAPP would be required for that. I think where sometimes it gets a little confusing is kind of that more of evaluation or use activity. So one that comes up often is modeling. QAPPs are required for modeling, and they're structured a little bit differently because, data might not necessarily be generated, but it's certainly being used. So that's one. Or another one is the development of environmental software or the development and design of environmental technology. All those examples require QAPPs. And as you move through this program and you find you need an in-depth primer on how to put together a QAPP, then for any of these type of reasons, then certainly can call me back or work with Megan, because I've certainly done like a QAPP 101 and whatnot on how to write a QAPP. So getting into it, so the first one is a project QAPP, and if you've I think this is kind of like the most traditional type of QAPP. There's all QAPPs are broken into 4 elements: project management, data generation and acquisition, assessment and oversight, data validation, and usability. And so a project QAPP goes into really comprehensive detail about each one of those things. So, just generally, it will explain how the project is set up, how you're going to collect the data, why you're going to collect the data, how you're going to use it, and then how at the end of the project, whatever goals that were decided upon, did the project meet the goals, and how you're going to assess to ensure that they met the goals. And so it's a project QAPP is really like the who, what, where, when, why of a specific project. I think some of the things to keep in mind with project QAPPs is they generally address one goal or one data quality objective, that's DQO, or one data use. So sometimes project QAPPs can address more than one goal or DQO, but they can get a little big and cumbersome and it can become confusing. So it's usually best when that project QAPP focuses on one thing. Another key of project QAPPs is that there's a defined start and end date. Usually there's a schedule in the QAPP, and it's laid out about when different components of the project are going to begin and end. Yeah, that was that. A specific example of a project QAPP would be, I'll just go back here so people aren't reading ahead. So one QAPP that we had was that we were going to go and investigate in the Yakima Valley, the aquifer there, and we want to look at nitrate levels specifically in some of the agricultural areas. So really the data quality objective was that we were going to go and measure nitrate to see whether or not it was impacting the drinking water out there, and if it was below the MCL or maximum contaminant level for nitrate. And so the project QAPP discussed how we were going to go about doing that, which involved drilling groundwater sampling wells, taking those samples, sending them to a lab, having that laboratory data validated, and then determining whether or not that water was above or below the MCL for nitrate. And so that was one project. Had a clear start and end. We had clear points of where what we were trying to accomplish, and then it really documented from the point of how the samples were going to be collected, the method we were going to use, the analytical methods that were going to be done, how the data was going to be validated, and then how at the end we were going to look at all that data and whether or not there's going to be any statistical comparison. So all that was documented, finished, and that project was complete. And so that is one example of just a project QAPP. So next is a generic QAPP, and it's kind of has a bad misnomer, generic, because it makes it seem like it could be anything. But generic QAPPs are fairly specific. It does usually have a lot of the same components of the project QAPP, so it's going to have those 4 elements we talked about earlier. However, a generic QAPP usually can cover multiple sites or systems or projects, but the one thing that has to stay the same really is first that goal or DQO is usually very similar, if not the same, for all the projects. So all the projects are linked back to one overall objective. Maybe it's something that's a little generalized. Say that it's monitoring in one area for one specific thing, or it's it could be really specific. And so and in terms of a generic QAPP, there are ways to determine whether or not a generic QAPP is right for a project. One of the main things is the level of quality that is needed is going to be the same for all the projects. It's really because that's usually linked back to the data quality objective. And so if you have a different data quality objective, it's very hard to write that into one QAPP. So for example, if one project wants to look at drinking water levels, but another project is just looking at baseline, it can get very messy to try to explain those different data quality objectives and the level of quality that's going to be needed for both of those projects, because drinking water projects are usually a lot more strict because they require a Safe Drinking Water Act methods, and there's usually a much higher level of scrutiny associated with them. As for baseline, there could be a lot of reasons to collect it. It could be something as general as just educating a community to something more specific that you want to test water quality standards and you want something written to the Clean Water Act. But and so if you have a broad range like that, drinking water compared to baseline, you might not have the same level of quality that's needed. That the drinking water project will need a lot more quality review and have more criteria than, say, a baseline QAPP. And so that's one really specific thing about a generic QAPP is you're going to be looking really at what level of quality is needed across all the projects that would be covered under that generic QAPP. The other thing you would want to make sure is, is putting a generic QAPP really going to require less time, resources, in managing it versus having multiple project-specific QAPPs. I mean, sometimes a generic QAPP can get so large because there's so many components to it that it actually ends up taking more time than just having single specific QAPPs across the board. So you'd really want to make sure that that if by putting together a generic QAPP, it will save you time, energy, resources, etc. Otherwise, it might not be in your best interest to go through that whole process. And so next on to programmatic QAPPs. And programmatic QAPPs, in some sense, could be very similar to a generic QAPP. One of the key differences, though, is that programmatic QAPPs are usually linked to either a program or a regulation or a statute. Like there's a specific program that is going to fall under this QAPP, and that's why it's written. A good example of this that we see often is some of the state QAPPs that we review and approve, specifically the programmatic linked ones like the pesticide programs that we see out of the ag community, because it's really the QAPP is written to whatever law, regulation, or policy that ag, it's usually some sort of inspection, but that ag program is trying to conduct. So one of the ones I just reviewed was for the Alaska Department of Environmental Conservation, and it was their pesticide control program, and it was specifically about them going to inspect facilities and what was needed to do that. The level of training for the different inspectors going out, the type of documentation they needed. They rarely take samples, but there was the ability to take samples of opportunity. But it was all linked back to their legislature rules and policies about why the pesticide control program operated and within what context and laws they're following to operate. So it is, and then it described that specific program, like I mentioned, the type of training the inspectors needed, what kind of documentation was required. If a sample was sent to a lab, what laboratory would they use, and how those samples would be analyzed. So it's a little bit more high level than, say, a project specific one, because it was really focused on things that could occur but may not always occur. In a project specific one, it's more likely you're going to go through those steps. But for this programmatic QAPP, when the inspectors would go out into the field and take a sample, they might not go or when the inspectors go out, and do an inspection, they might not take a sample, but the QAPP was written in the event that they did. So it was a little bit more generalized. So how does the programmatic QAPP differ from a generic QAPP? Well, like I just talked about, it's really associated with an environmental program that is linked to some sort of regulation, statute, or rule. Those are primarily the ways we see the programmatic QAPPs come through. EPA has a programmatic QAPP for our inspection program, for those going out and doing inspections, very similar to the ag one that I talked about. And it really describes the policies within that program and how that program is going to operate, specifically in terms of the QA and QC requirements and documentation they'll need to ensure that that program is operating to the best of its ability to collect usable data for whatever that program goal is. And the last one I was going to discuss was it was an umbrella QAPP. So really an umbrella QAPP is kind of a subset of the QAPPs I talked about earlier. It's an umbrella QAPP could be used as part of a generic project or programmatic QAPP. What an umbrella QAPP really is you have a parent QAPP, an overarching QAPP that has a lot of elements that are similar for a project, and then there are additional addenda or site-specific sampling plans that are attached to that overarching QAPP that go into the specifics of a project. I don't want to go there yet. So I wanted to give an example before I went to that. So one project that we had that had an umbrella QAPP was one in Alaska, and there was an agency that was doing a baseline erosion study where they were using time-lapse photography. And this Alaska agency had all of the resources to conduct that project. They had the cameras, they had the equipment, the training materials, but they didn't have access to locations where they could use this. And so they wrote a QAPP, and they wrote the overarching piece, which discussed, the objective of the overall project, which was to take baseline photographs to document erosion over time. And then they documented the protocol for taking these, the training mechanism, and kind of the end goals, and how are they going to assess the end goal criteria at the end. But what they didn't have was where they were going to take these pictures, and they needed volunteer communities to not only identify places but also sign on, because the way that this project worked is someone would go out there and take a picture. I think it was daily or weekly, and so they had to house the camera and they had to set it up and take this picture weekly, let's say. And so over the course of a year, they would have all these pictures and they could analyze them. And so so this Alaska agency had this overarching QAPP, and then once they had communities volunteer, the communities would list some of the more specific information. So they would have things like who in the community was going to do the work, how that person was going to get trained, how that person was then going to send that data to the Alaska agencies. And because at the beginning of the project, they didn't know which communities would volunteer, they included a template for a site-specific sampling plan that was then filled out by the volunteer communities. And it was like a 3-page document that identified who was going to do it and how they were going to get trained and things like that. And so that was how that umbrella QAPP worked. All right, so we've gone through all 4 of those different kinds of QAPPs, and this is just a nice synopsis of everything as you kind of consider all of the different elements of each one and are thinking about whether or not this would work for this program. This is just a good reference to look at kind of what was similar and what was different. And so for a project QAPP, that was really best for individual projects. So if it's decided that, everyone who signs on to this program does their own QAPP, then it's certainly going to be, they're all going to be project QAPPs. The generic QAPP was best for when there were multiple projects, but they all have a similar, or if not the same goal, and there are common elements that can be referenced. So everyone's going to use these methods or protocols when they're taking samples, but it all links back to the same goal. Programmatic QAPPs are really specific for when you're associating something to a specific program or regulation or statute. And then the umbrella QAPP, which we just talked about, was it was a subset of the generic or programmatic QAPP, but the overarching elements are identified in a parent QAPP, and then there's addenda that are associated with it that explain some of the more site-specific information. And yeah, that is the end. Again, there's my contact. I think you have this presentation, so feel free to share it with the group. And as you move forward, if you have questions or it's determined that every project person needs a QAPP, certainly reach out to me, and we can get more information about how best to write these documents.
Thanks so much to Donald. We've got a couple minutes if folks have specific questions on this presentation, and then we're going to move into some other discussions about sort of what might be applicable for throughout the basin. So, Andy James, I see you've got a hand up. Andy, go ahead.
Yeah, thanks for the overview. I have a question about something like a generic QAPP, and whether that covers it, like in the instance where you apply the same methodology on a bunch of different projects, I guess, same QA objectives apply. Would that also apply to potential future projects that have the same quality objectives, but maybe it's a new site or something like that, Or do you have to do all the sampling sites, for example, have to be identified at the time of writing the generic QAPP?
So yeah, short answer is yes, you could consider like future sites, and they could fit in like maybe with an additional addendum or something. I think the key would be ensuring that it matches up to whatever that objective was that you identified on there, and making sure that it lines up, as well as making sure that the quality criteria that you wanted would also apply to this new future project. But yeah, that could work.
Okay, good, thanks.
Thanks, Andy. Does anyone else have a question? You can feel free to raise your hand, put your question in the chat.
Well, we do have the Slido questions are pretty open-ended too. Oh,
okay.
I see Tim has a question.
Tim's got one. Tim, go ahead.
Thanks so much for your presentation. That was really informative. I appreciate it. So just not to pin you down or anything, or make you say something that is restrictive, but do you see any benefit in the context of kind of what we're discussing here, to having like an umbrella QAPP or generic QAPP, or do you think that there are efficiencies associated with it?
Sure. Yeah, certainly. I mean, so if all of the projects agreed upon, say, the same sampling protocol, or say sampling methods were all going to be simple or the same, then the generic QAPP could be like a referenced document. So not everyone would have to go and reinvent the wheel. They would all just be able to say, hey, this is our overall arching document, and this has all of our sampling protocol in there. So you don't have to write it again and again and again for each QAPP. So you would gain, I mean, if you've developed a QAPP before, I mean, can be a lengthy process. So it would cut down on some of that resource that would be needed for that development.
So in the context of like adaptively managing programs, if you have something in an umbrella QAPP and perhaps you want to alter that criteria, is that possible?
It depends on what's being altered. I think the hardest one is if it's like the data quality objective or the goal, like all of a sudden midstream, you want to change the reason you're acquiring the data from one thing to the next. So, I mean, I'll give you an example. This comes up often. In Alaska, some of the native villages, they are collecting data for baseline. And then and then they want to, once they collect that data, they see that there's something in there that could trigger a review of a water quality standard or regulation. So, for example, if I'll go back to the nitrate, let's say while they're collecting data, they see that nitrate is really high and it's above the MCL. So now they want to approach ADEC and say, hey, our water is impaired. Well, their DQO was different, right? They're originally collecting for baseline, but now they're trying to collect for regulatory purposes. So the methods they may have used might not meet regulatory criteria. The review might not be robust enough for regulatory criteria. It just depends. And so if that DQO changes midstream, then it's very difficult then to make that change in a QAPP. You almost have to write a new one. But aside from that, you can make certain adjustments.
Thank you so much.
Mm-hmm.
So Jen, is it okay if we take one more question from
Sure,
Patrick?
sure,
before we
yeah,
move on
no,
to
it's-
questions from Slido. Patrick Moran, go ahead.
I thanks, Donald. That was really helpful. I guess I had a similar thinking as Tim in thinking about efficiencies. It seems like a lot of attention in QAPPs and a lot more detail is applied for laboratory measurements. And if people were using similar methods and similar laboratories, is that a case where a generic or programmatic QAPP might apply? And then I guess secondly, are there examples of that are currently in place with EPA?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, for that first part, yeah. I mean, that would definitely be a good efficiency for using kind of a generic QAPP is, if it's the same lab or same bunch of labs that are being used and they're all referenced in there, then yeah, you wouldn't have to reinvent the wheel when explaining all of the different sampling protocol or sampling labels or how you're maintaining custody. All those type of things could be generalized across multiple projects. And yeah, as for examples, that's tougher. EPA doesn't have a lot of generic QAPP examples. I would probably look to like the states because we review a lot of their programmatic QAPPs as they come through, and they do have some good examples. I know Ecology does, as well as Alaska. So,
okay, thanks.
No problem.
Go ahead, Laura.
If
Time for more. Yeah, go ahead.
if you had an umbrella QAPP that it sounds like that's a subset of a generic QAPP, and then as adaptive management happened, could you then submit those addenda for those additional data quality objectives, or is that not how that works?
Yeah, so for like for any type of like the programmatic or generic, usually they're linked to one DQL because they're going to have a similar quality criteria across the board. So you usually can't write that into like an addenda, like a different DQL, because there's a lot that goes into that portion of it. Depending on what that DQL is, the QA QC criteria behind it could be very different from, I think the example I gave earlier, one could be like a baseline monitoring, or another could be a monitoring for regulatory purposes, and so it'd be hard to write those differences in an addenda.
Okay.
So maybe Greg will drop the first question, which is very open-ended about.
I was going to say, yeah.
And then we'll just kind of see what discussion we have. I think this is a really important discussion for everyone. I think it's good to let it play out a little bit. So this is Slido. If you haven't used it before, the easiest way is to use a phone. If you happen to have a phone with you, and hold it up to that QR code, and then just touch the screen. It'll open in whatever browser you use, or you can go to slido.com. If you aren't able to access any of that, and we have seen a few agency restrictions there, you can put your comments in the chat. But this is basically, we're just trying to gather, more feedback about what sort of assistance. And I realize some of you might be thinking, I'm not sure if I have a project that's going to be funded that needs a QAPP. So this might be a little premature, but a lot of you are engaged in work and are thinking along these lines. So
you can also hi, this is Becca. You can also access the poll. Like, I dropped the link in the chat, and that will take you to the Slido page, and you can access the poll there, and then enter your comment, and it'll pop up here on the screen.
Thanks, Becca. And if anybody wants to ask another question while we're just giving, some people another way to provide input, basically is all this is. So.
Yeah, I see Patrick and Laura still have hands raised. Is that, are those new questions, or were those from the previous ones? There they go.
Taking mine down.
Yeah, thank you.
And while you're typing, I see we have a couple other folks that have joined us. Margaret Drennan, welcome from the Washington Department of Agriculture. Mark Jankowski from EPA, thanks for joining. We've got a couple users who are calling in from phone lines. Do you want to introduce yourselves?
Sure, Jim Medlin. No volume on my
okay.
on the meeting, so I just called in as well. So I'm one of the phone lines on there. Thanks.
Welcome back.
And I see Jennifer Moraes from USGS has joined.
Okay.
Welcome, Jennifer. Okay. Like there's a couple more people typing. Any other general questions?
Yeah, if people are having trouble with the Slido at all, just use the chat. You can put your input there, and we'll get it. We'll make sure to track it for you.
And we'll share Donald's contact and Megan's when we send out notes, but that's also in the chat from Greg earlier. And it is brown.donaldm, right? Important to get the M in there. Being one of many Jennifers right now, Donald, I can appreciate that occasionally I get emails that were not meant for me. So that might happen to you too. Okay, so we're seeing that some folks feel very comfortable. Department of Ecology has a process. They're not looking for help. Others are making some good suggestions here, Greg, right? I don't know if any of these, Donald, if it's helpful, if you want to weigh in on any of these right now, if that's helpful or not. I'm going to put you on the spot.
Yeah, I'm reading through these. I mean, yeah, similar to what you mentioned. My contact is there as well as Megan. So, if there are specific questions as QAPP development is occurring, certainly reach out.
Donald, can I ask a question? What do you think folks struggle with the most?
The data quality objective process, unless it's pretty clear. Like you're doing water monitoring to compare results to like water quality standards or something. If it's not that clear, often it's hard to determine or define what the data quality objective is and the ultimate data use. So
Thanks.
And I had another question for you. Is it Don or Donald?
Donald, and the reason is there's another Donald on the QA team at EPA, Don Matheny.
Oh.
So he goes by Don and I go by Donald just to make things a little
Gotcha.
easier.
Okay. So Donald, we haven't developed a monitoring, I guess, plan request yet for funding, and so I don't think any of our requests really required QAPPs to date. So my question is, I mean, are there requirements that we follow the EPA's template, or is it kind of we have something that meets or exceeds that we could use our own?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, the kind of the basic requirements is EPA has a document, the R5. It's the requirements for QAPPs. That's what my team uses for reviewing them. But if you have another template, or all of the states in Region 10, Idaho, Oregon, Ecology, and Alaska have their own delegated quality programs, and so I've reviewed and their QMPs, and so all of their QAPP templates have been approved by EPA for use. So I think I saw a comment here that Ecology has a process. Yeah, I mean, I've vetted it, and that's good. So if you have, Ecology has a great template too. So if you have to add that, that's an option as well.
Okay. Yeah, I was just kind of wondering about how it all
Well,
coordinates. Yeah.
Sure, and I'll throw out there too that even though it's really focused on tribal projects, the EPA Region 10 has a great tribal QAPP website. I can put it in the chat here, but it's an overview of QAPPs, why they're needed, the components of them, and it also provides resources like templates and examples and things like that. Again, it is the Region 10 tribal QAPP page, so it is focused on tribes, but I think it has enough generalizable knowledge that people could glean a lot of things from that. So I'll put that in the chat as well.
Thanks, Donald.
Thanks, Donald. So it looks like a couple of comments about efficiencies and streamlining. See a couple of comments requesting specific help, and then integrating the tributaries in the main stem. And I can't see the other comments that were put in before that, but we'll kind of roll these up and summarize these in the meeting notes when we pull them together. And thanks, Becca. Formatting and working with reviewers. Great. Jen, should we move along to the? Oh, is there?
Maybe we can. Maybe let's drop. Hold on one second, Patrick. Let's drop the next question in the Slido. People can ponder that while we hear Patrick's question.
Yeah, thanks, Jen. I was just thinking to myself, there's two sides of effort on the QAPP. It takes a lot of review and time on EPA's part also, and feedback. So from a large program like this point of view, when you get new dollars come in, let's say 1 million or 2 million, do you have a rule of thumb for the percent of time that you might need to set aside to manage the QAPPs that are going to go on your part? And then parallel wise, I mean, I'm sure it varies a lot, but is there a rule of thumb for how much you think the recipients should be budgeting to go through the QAPP process for their dollars that they receive?
That question to me. I might, if Michelle's on here, I saw her earlier, and then she said she had to leave, I think. That's a good question for like a project officer at EPA who generally works with the grantees on. I usually don't see that side. I mean, we have kind of guidelines for reviewing QAPPs, but that's that's definitely not what you're looking for. You know, I mean, it's hard to say on the grant side. I think it's kind of all over the place based on experience on how much time. I mean, we try. The one limitation, you know, is there's myself and a team of 4, and so and we're overseeing the entire quality system in Region 10. So beyond the water program, there's enforcement, Superfund, and whatnot. So that's kind of a limitation for us, and that can extend our review times and whatnot, as well as our ability to help out at times.
For sure.
So
yeah.
Thanks, Patrick and Donald. And so this question you see now is this, remember, these are both in the spirit of our very first meeting a few months ago, where we asked, what can we do to get to more consistent, perhaps, data that could be used by multiple entities for different objectives, perhaps? How might we get to that place? Because we saw from Donald's presentation and the discussion, maybe we aren't a program with the same DQOs that could therefore benefit from one of these formal other types of COPs. Are there other things that we could do to get towards that bigger goal of consistency and data compatibility? Just looking for things that we can do down the road to potentially help you. And I realize this is a big question. We did have some discussion at that first meeting, so we haven't forgotten that or thrown it out. We'll come back around to it and add this input to it. But I know some of you weren't there, and I think it's important in the context of what Donald just shared, because we all got pretty darn excited about a generalized QAPP, which, you know, it wasn't even on Donald's list of types of QAPPs. That was just something we were wishing for. But there's a certain aspect of efficiency, right? I think we've heard people mention. Okay. I see
Megan,
Patrick. I don't know if your hand is still up or up again, or Megan.
Hi, just request to log and share these comments. These are good food for thought. So maybe I missed that. But I would love to see a copy of these.
Oh yeah, sorry.
Yeah.
We will share all the
Slido.
results.
Okay.
Yeah, absolutely.
Thank you.
Yes, we'll put the results in the notes for everybody.
Slido does a nice job summarizing, so it's again.
Makes it easy for the note takers too of the world. So, and you know, some people are really willing to speak, and some people would rather type something and throw that out there. So Greg, I don't know, a couple more minutes, and we do have 2 more topics.
I was just looking back at the March meeting summary, and when we were discussing this topic, and things that that came up were the need for consistency would be beneficial to be able to compare results across the basin, some sort of baseline or minimum standards, monitoring thresholds, so that you know, to the extent folks could coordinate and ensure that their methods are consistent, but at the same time allowing flexibility to keep it from being too prescriptive, as you touched on in your opening remarks about the goals for this group, Jen. And then just how do you manage the volume of work? And I think, Donald, on some of your, in comparing some of the pros and cons of the various types of QAPPs, you know, the pro that you mentioned in response to one of the questions of reducing that kind of workload for doing it multiple times, I think that's one of the benefits. I don't know if there are any other kind of benefits for or ways to streamline the process that you can think of.
Yeah, not off the top of my head. Besides, I mean, I think I'd seen as a comment too, but templates, right? If a lot of projects are doing a similar type of project that they're, say, like just baseline monitoring or water monitoring, then if you had a template, and that would go a long ways.
Yeah.